Stubborn.
My lady, please may I call the first witness for today?
If you'd like to stand, please, take the Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Robert Samuel Swan.
And I think, Mr. Swan, you ought to have before you two witness statements, one of which you signed on the 15th of January 2023, and I think which should run to some 93 pages. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think you've signed that on the final on the final page, yes?
Yes.
And are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and
I am.
belief? And I think, Mr. Swan, you then signed a second witness statement on the 19th of March 2024. Yes?
That's correct, yeah.
And again, are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
Mr. Swan, I think it's right that you were first elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2011. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you were re-elected in 2016, 2017 and 2022.
That's correct.
And I think during your time as a member, you served as the deputy chair or chair on a number of assembly committees. And that from April 2012, you served as the Ulster Unionist chief whip until you became party leader in April 2017. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And I think it's also right that you resigned from that position in November 2019 and then became the Minister for Health from the 11th of January 2020 onwards. Is that
That's
also
correct, yes.
right? And I think it's right that you remained a Minister until the 27th of October 2022.
Correct, yeah.
And I think that it's right that that period of your being a minister ended whenever the power sharing arrangements once again collapsed.
That's correct,
in 2022. Yes. So you were more or less in position for the entire period that the inquiry's considering. And I think it's right that you are health minister once again, and power sharing arrangements having resumed quite recently.
That's correct, yeah.
Right. Just turning then to the role of health minister in Northern Ireland, it is correct, isn't it, that it's an extremely broad brief covering as it does both health and social care?
It does. I suppose that's the differential from other jurisdictions as well. We have that combined service.
So again, we've asked other witnesses about that, but it isn't just the provision of primary and secondary health care, for example. It extends into the oversight and responsibility of old people's homes or care homes, as well as the provision of ordinary adult social care services and children's social care services as well.
That's correct,
the
yes.
full gamut. The inquiry has received an expert report from Professors Gray and O'Connor, and part of it covers the role of the Health Minister in Northern Ireland. And they've given evidence that under the DeHunt formula, the Health Minister is ordinarily one of the positions that comes near to the bottom of the list of ministerial positions that parties want to take. Is that right?
That would be correct, apart from my own party.
Yes.
My lady, the Ulster Unionist Party, has actually selected health. When it had the option to do that, it would have had the option to select other departments, even in 2011 when we did come back, even when we restored again at the start of this year. There were other departments that could have been available for my party to select, but we selected health because we do believe it is an important department. We do believe it can deliver for the people in Northern Ireland, and that's what we actually want to do, my lady.
All right. So not a popular department in terms of other parties, but nonetheless a crucial one in Northern Ireland.
No, I think it would be fair to say it would be one that would be avoided by other parties, as we've seen through the runs of the hunt in previous elections.
All right. I'm going to come in a moment, if I may, to some of the challenges involved in running the department. I wanted to ask you, though, just by way of general introduction, a bit about the Ministerial Code in Northern Ireland. We haven't taken anyone to this. We have it on screen. It's INQ 000262764. And I was just going to start at page 5, if I may. Thank you. And I think we can see, sorry, that's just to, I'm sure you're familiar with it, Mr. Swan. If we could go, please, to, we have it there, page 5. So paragraph 1.4, this is the pledge of office that ministers take. I'm not going to go through all of it, Mr. Swan, but they have ministers pledged to discharge in good faith all of the duties in office. Correct?
Correct, yeah.
And then we see at C, to serve all of the people in Northern Ireland equally, to act in accordance with the general obligations on government, to promote equality and prevent discrimination. And then CA, to promote the interests of the whole community towards the goal of a shared future. Correct?
That's correct, yes.
And if we go to page 9, please. And paragraph 2.3, I just wanted to introduce again, Mr. Swan, through you, the functions of the Executive Committee. And I think it's right that this provides guidance, and I should say it's statutory guidance, of course, as to what the role of the Executive Committee is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And we see that it provides a forum for, at little I, the discussion and agreement on issues which cut across the responsibilities of 2 or more ministers. Correct?
That's correct, yes.
And at 4, to recommend a common position where necessary.
Yes.
And 5, we've heard a bit about this, but agreement on budgets and the programme for government as well.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And if we could go over, please, to page 10. And then at 6, discussion of an agreement upon significant or controversial matters that are clearly outside the scope of the agreed programme of government. So is that a sort of catch-all provision for all of the things that fall outside the programme for government?
I think it is, my lady, as well. Paragraph 2.4, I think, is particularly pertinent during the discussions as well, but maybe you're moving on to that. It's actually about the duty to what is cross-cutting but also requires prioritisation and a common purpose.
I was going to come to that, and perhaps if we could just bring that up. And so, thank you. So yes, so it is expressed as a duty, first of all, to bring to the committee anything that cuts across the responsibilities of 2 or more ministers, requires agreement on prioritisation, or requires the adoption of a common position. Yes?
That's correct, yeah.
And again, I think it must be right, Mr. Swan, that during the pandemic, those were the principles upon which you brought matters related to the response of the pandemic to the Executive Committee.
Very much so, my lady. It was actually that paragraph 2.4, which was my core thrust, my driver to actually anything that I was doing in regards to decisions being made that would have affected not outside of health, but not the people of Northern Ireland, because any of those decisions, those regulations, the recommendations that we were making as a Department of Health to the whole executive were having a wide range, or would have a wide-ranging impact, and that's why I always felt that 2.4 was that driving duty that I had, was actually to bring everything that required that to the executive for decision and discussion as well.
And just before we leave this, I think again 5 is probably quite important, because the duty extends to anything which is significant or controversial. Yes, yeah. And perhaps significant is the more important of those in relation to the pandemic. Would that be correct?
Well, I would also say that controversial in regards to the fact that we were a 5-party mandatory coalition just re-established after 3 years of there not being a government in Northern Ireland. So in regards to some of the decisions that I was making, or the proposals I was making, they were controversial, because we were, unlike other voluntary coalitions that are established across these islands, we were an executive that covered from the left to the right, from nationalist, unionist and other, from socialist to conservative middle 80s, so it was quite an eclectic mix of ministers. So what may have seemed or not seemed controversial to some was controversial to others. So that's why I think 2.4 and especially 0.5, not just significant but also controversial, was important to bring things to the executive.
I think we'll come on in the course of your evidence perhaps to examine some of the things that were more controversial perhaps than others. But just in terms of, again, and I'm just asking you about the general position, I think that can come down, thank you. The inquiry has heard that although you occupied this central and pivotal position during the response to the pandemic, that you were the lone minister for your party on the executive committee. In general terms, can you explain whether that did impact upon your position or the way that it impacted upon your position?
My lady, I think in regards to that, it was a challenging position to be there as the sole Ulster Unionist Minister. Even in the reconstituted executive, I'm still the sole Ulster Unionist Minister, so there are challenges that come with that position. But from a personal reflection, I actually think entering the pandemic, it was a strength because, as has been already laid out in my political history, I didn't hold either a leadership position within my party at the point I took up minister, so I wasn't, I suppose, bound by the constraints of having to answer to party political pressures from outside. My other other executive colleagues did hold party positions as well, but being the sole minister in there, I think allowed me to step outside some of the constitutional challenges that faced the two larger parties, where at times they could have been seemed to be more antagonistic, or especially in regards to where they looked for, I suppose, their ultimate direction in regards to that. There were challenges, and I think it's already been mentioned, whereas we had the tendency, Sinn Féin did take a look and keep an eye on what was happening in the Republic of Ireland, and likewise the DUP were focused on what was happening in Westminster. Whereas being bound by neither of those, I believe I was able to take a direction which best suited the response in Northern Ireland.
And maybe we'll come on to this in a bit more detail in a little while, but did you perceive that your executive colleagues who held those sorts of positions were then under political pressure in terms of factors external to the executive committee, or because of the positions that they held?
My lady, I do believe that in regards to other ministers coming from those bigger parties, those bigger groupings as well, had to look to party structures and party guidance. Other ministers holding actually party leadership positions also had to be conscious of what was going on elsewhere, which I felt I was encumbered by that. It's the structure of my party, the way we work in regards to the autonomy that is actually given to some of our ministers, or given to our ministers.
We'll look at some specific examples. Perhaps you've characterised it as a strength, but did it also present challenges to your position that you had no colleagues on the committee?
Well, it did in regards to, I had no party colleagues as well, but in my statement I actually refer that I felt well supported by my other executive colleagues, especially in the early days. And now I've seen from other evidence and some statements as well that may not have been the entire perception through the pandemic as well. But when it came to how I personally felt as an Ulster Unionist Minister within the executive, it was a lonely position at times. It was a challenging position at times, but I think it was one that I believed at the time that I did have the support of my other ministerial colleagues in doing what we had to do.
All right. I'm going to come on there, and I will take you through some of the material, I think, to which you've referred. But again, just focusing on some of the generalities, perhaps, to begin with. Miss Naomi Long, who was a minister during that period, has identified some of the difficulties that she perceived she and Minister Mallon faced at the time, they not having colleagues either, although obviously they were in a different position from you because you were driving much of the response. But let me just put some of the points that she made to you and ask you if you recognise them. What she has said is, first of all, that she became concerned that there was sometimes a pre-negotiation between the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister and you about the recommendations that would be put to the Executive Committee. So in other words, that a pre-negotiation effectively conditioned what came before the executive committee. Now, there may be good reasons if that was the case, but is that correct? Was there a process of negotiation?
I wouldn't classify it as negotiation. I think as elsewhere in other jurisdictions, prior to, I think it was actually June, when the Executive Office picked up the responsibility of bringing papers to the executive meetings in regards to recommendations, there would have been pre-meetings where I would have engaged with the First and Deputy First Minister in regards to what we thought was what was needed, what was going to be required for us. They drafted the paper then, because those recommendations came forward from June onwards, actually as an executive paper rather than a Department of Health paper.
Okay, Mr. I'm going to just ask you, I think you're just to slow down perhaps
Apologies,
a touch. So sorry, I'm just going to, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I could tell you were going a bit fast. Would you mind just repeating the final part of what you said?
No, sorry, it wasn't as much as a negotiation in regards to what was going to be presented in papers. From June onwards, the recommendations coming to the executive were executive office papers, so they've been brought forward by the First and Deputy First Minister. So it was more of us having input and as to what those recommendations were. And I don't think that would have been any different from any other jurisdiction or government where health was actually feeding into government recommendations.
I think what this goes to, and I'll take you to some other points that she made, I think perhaps overall a sense of perhaps a lack of control over what it was that the executive committee was being asked to sign off on. But if I could just take you through some of the points that she made sequentially. I think first of all, she said that she would regularly hear via the media the options that would be coming to the executive for decision. Again, is that something that you were conscious of at the time, that was being, I assume, leaked in advance of the meetings?
My lady, I think it was one of my largest frustrations in regards to how executive papers were handled, how they were leaked, when they were leaked, because I have often felt that it was actually deliberate in regards to either conditioning what the conversation that was going to be had at the executive, and also to bring stakeholders. You know, when those papers were presented or shared through executive colleagues, often late on the night before, that they were already with the media before the executive had actually met to discuss them. So there was already a narrative established in public discourse, established in the media, to either support or mostly undermine recommendations that were actually coming to the executive. So before those conversations could be had, those decisions could be made across the five parties, there was already preconceived positioning going into the executive meeting.
Can I just explore that a bit more with you? Do you mean that colleagues would leak it to the press because they wanted effectively to whip up a narrative in the media about it, to put ministers under pressure once they were in the executive committee?
Very much so, but you know, and again, that's where I express my frustration, and often expressed it at executive meetings, because what could have been robust meetings confidentially had around an executive table, likewise that we're having across other governments as well, where we could have come to a joint united position and actually presented that to the media. People were already being driven into sides or silos or in support of their stakeholders or in their department responsibilities prior to being able to either have the wider conversation or actually receive the presentations or the evidence that was maybe coming from the CMO or the CSA as to why those decisions were actually being asked for or actually recommended.
The inquiry's also seen that not only were papers leaked or options leaked to the media, but often it seems, perhaps it's not often, you will know and be able to tell the inquiry, but that meetings were being leaked whilst they were going on as well. Is that correct?
That is correct. And again, as I've expressed my frustration. Frustration was also expressed greatly around the executive table as well. That at times there was almost a live feed coming from the executive, especially when it came to those more challenging, those more robust decisions that would have to be taken, that it was actually being portrayed lifetime on Twitter in regards to who had said what, who was saying what as well. So not only was there political or stakeholder pressure being put on that as well. It was also being clearly portrayed by some about personal positions being taken, who was saying what. So it left it extremely challenging, I think, at times for some ministers to be clearly open or even step outside the bounds of what would have been their own party position, because there was that perception if they said too much or strayed too far that it was already going to be received and portrayed in the media as well.
Did anybody think to ban the use of personal devices during executive meetings?
My lady, there was all sorts of attempts made, but the fact that our executive meetings were being held remotely by Zoom, there was challenges as well about who actually was behind the screen. There were recommendations made by the head of civil service at one stage, even that while ministers were on, they should have their cameras on at some time, all times, not just when they were speaking as well, so that could be seen. So it was a very challenging time as well in regards to how we managed that. But that frustration of leaks and actually pre-perceiving or pre-trying to diagnose where an executive would go or take a decision was highly challenging for all of us.
I mean, it might be thought, Mr. Swan, that need for confidentiality is so important that, first of all, ministers would all appreciate and understand the importance of that to them as individuals, and that need, the collective responsibility to provide confidentiality to each other. That serious questions would be asked and raised about this ongoing leaking, but it just seems to have been tolerated.
I do recall, and I referenced it in my statement, there was one attempt at a leak inquiry that was undertaken by the then permanent Secretary of the Department of Finance. There was questions put out, but there was never, that I can recall, a finding that actually came from that inquiry as well. It became a frustration, but I also believe at one point it was so endemic that it became tolerated rather than challenged in regards to what was actually happening.
I'm going to move on to the next point, if I may, that Miss Long made. She said that at times she felt as though decisions had already been taken by the point that her input was sought, and that she was rubber stamping discussions that others had had, but expected to take full responsibility for them. Again, is that something you recognise or perhaps understand may have been the perception on the part of other ministers?
I could see where that may have been a perception, but having worked with Miss Long in the executive prior to this, I don't ever think she could be characterised as someone who would simply rubber stamp something that she didn't agree with. In regards to that, she would make her position known, she would make her objections known in regards to that, but I don't think she would simply be one who would accept something because that was the paper that come forward without challenging it herself.
Well, in ordinary times, I suppose that might be the case, but in the context of a pandemic where ministers might feel under enormous pressure to provide agreement quickly, for example, one might see that the perception could be different, or the perception of pressure could be different.
There was pressure. I think there was pressures on us all in regards to coming forward with those recommendations or following them as well. But to perceive that anyone round that table, and milady, you've met some of our executive ministers already through this inquiry, I can assure you, I never found any of them shrinking violets or without personality or strength that wouldn't make their own opinions or decisions known, that it was simply a rubber stamping exercise. And I think when I reflect, on those hand transcribed notes that was actually presented, something I didn't know was actually taking place when I was a minister in the executive. When you see them going on to 30, 40 pages, executive meetings that lasted 4, 5, 6 hours, I don't think it could be perceived as simply a paper being presented, rubber stamped, and we moved on to the next item. There was robust decisions around the executive table and any of the recommendations that were being brought forward.
All right. I think we might examine some of those, I suppose, the decisions that were taken or positions that were adopted in a bit more detail. Again, just staying on the general position, if I may, and moving on to the impact that the absence of power sharing had between 2017 and 2020 on the response to the pandemic, so not preparedness, whether or not it continued to impact thereafter. And you said on the 13th of April 2021 that the pre-existing fragilities in our system also undoubtedly hampered our response to the pandemic. They also underlined the particular need for caution in Northern Ireland as we emerge from lockdown. And that was a statement, I think, that you made to the Assembly, if I remember correctly. So you do appear to have been saying there that the response was conditioned by the state that health services perhaps had been left in. Is that correct?
That's correct, very much so. When I came into office in 2011, after those 3 years of not having an executive, not having a minister, my lady were actually, at that point we were industrial action. Our nurses were on strike the first time the Royal College of Nursing had ever taken industrial action. This is before anything we've seen across the rest of the UK. So my key challenge, the executive's key challenge, was actually ending that industrial dispute on the return of the executive. That had broken down, I think, relationships across health and social care, but it also had a dramatic effect on the morale of our health staff and our health workers. In regards to what needed to be done then. So we did find our health service workers in a very fragile, undervalued state. And I think that was what I tried to do when I came in as Minister, was actually to re-engage with them and build up that and show that not only did I appreciate what they were doing, but Northern Ireland appreciated what the Executive did as well. And I think we managed to restore that. Also, in regards to the fragility of our health service, we did 3 years of single non-recurrent budgets where civil servants who were in charge at that stage weren't able to take those large-scale strategic decisions, again because of a single-year budget, non-recurrent, which didn't allow the change to be made that we needed to be made. So in regards where we actually came during the pandemic, where there was recommendations to have green site hospitals, where hospitals could actually continue to deliver day case procedures, cancer treatments. Part of the reviews that we've now been able to undertake, the creation of day case procedures units, overnight stay units, post-anaesthetic care units, which have all been developed now. I believe, and this is a personal belief, that if we had had Minister in place through those 2020, and the strategic direction, the funding that we could have had some of those opportunities, those transformational pieces of healthcare actually in place, so that when it came to the steps that we needed to take during lockdown, we could have had some green site hospitals already established in Northern Ireland, where we could have designated those for the procedures that we needed to do that were normal red flag emergency procedures, while designating other hospitals to be COVID centres and the rest of that. We didn't have the opportunity to do that in that period between 2017 and 2020. So there was a lot of opportunity lost.
So is in effect what you're saying, it was that the impact was really on the services, for example, that you had to cancel during the pandemic because you didn't have sufficient capacity within hospitals and other care in order to be able to do both?
It was actually in regards to the overall resilience of health and social care, not just in the structures and where we could carry out certain procedures and those transformational pieces not having been made, but also the resilience of our staff. Part of the agreement that brought the executive back in January 2011, my lady New Decade, New Approach, which was negotiated or presented by the Irish and British governments, was actually one of the targets, and it was actually another 900 nursing training places over 3 years. So that was a clear indication that during 2017-2020 that we had under-recruited, we'd under-trained to a point that our health service actually needed that further injection of additional training places. So there was an indication of that need. So the fragility just wasn't how we were able to react there. It was about that lack of investment in our core service, that lack of investment in our healthcare workers, and that had been 10 years in the making, my lady. It just wasn't overnight.
All right. Now, we've focused on healthcare services. When you made that speech, when you addressed the Assembly, you talked about the system. Were you also talking about social care as well, or were you focusing on health, or do the same considerations apply as regards?
It was the same considerations, and I also, at one point in regards to, I think it was when I addressed one of the health committees at one point, I actually referred to social care and our domiciliary care as our Cinderella service. It had been one that I believe had been undervalued, underrepresented in regards to the finance, the input and the support, especially of the key workers in it as well, because, my lady, it's a workforce that isn't as unionised as our other recommendations as well, or our other health facilities, or other health services as well. So it was, I believe, and I still do, one of the, again, moving forward, one of the things when I come back in as Minister again was actually to put an injection of £70 million this time into our social care services to make sure that we could bring those workers up to a living wage level as well. So this was about steps that should have been taken, could have been taken, had we had ministers in place 2017, 2020, or even still in the past 2 years as well.
Northern Ireland obviously has an integrated health and social care system as well. The Bengoa report in 2016 had effectively said that integration was illusory, that it didn't really amount to much in practice, or the benefits of it weren't seen in practice. Is that something that you agree with?
I think when Bengoa actually said that out, there was a transformational piece of work, there's a work stream of it, and a review of our social care workforce in regards to how we could actually strengthen it. It hasn't. The reform of adult social care was actually something I launched prior to leaving in 2022 in regards to how that could be changed, how it could be strengthened. And it was part of the driver as to where that £70 million actually came at the start of this year. In regards to some of the recommendations that were made coming out or coming through the pandemic was actually the establishment of a social care collaborative forum where we were bringing together providers and the trade unions and all their workers as well, so we can make sure that those that section of our healthcare service could be supported. But Bengoa, I think, highlighted the issue that I think many recognised, and when I referred to our social care workers, our social care services, that Cinderella service, that was the perception I got when I came in as Minister in 2021 in regards to what work needed to be done, really to boost that. Because, my lady, with the benefit of having a social care or an integrated system, one of the strengths that I believe, if we truly empowered and enforced it, is when we look at that flow of patients through the entirety of our health service, the pressure that we see in our emergency departments currently is because we can't move patients quickly enough onto a hospital ward. We can't move patients onto a hospital ward because we can't move those patients who are in a hospital ward quickly enough out, either to be supported by a domiciliary care package or into a care home as well. So it's about that integration that I actually think is a strength to our system if it worked well and was properly supported.
But I think just coming back to January 2020 and the overall state of the system in Northern Ireland, is the inquiry correct to proceed on the basis that the supposedly integrated approach in Northern Ireland didn't really afford any benefit at that stage?
Actually, there was benefits in regards to how we could actually utilise, when we saw pressures on workforce, especially in domiciliary care homes. And I think because of the interconnected between trusts and care homes, we were actually able to see where nursing and healthcare workers were actually be able to be repurposed from our secondary care, from hospitals actually into care homes, to make sure they were properly staffed and supported as well. So when we put out our workforce appeal, it was actually to look where people, and actually a large cohort of retired nurses come back into the workforce appeal and were actually put into care homes who were struggling to staff as well. It also enabled us to get our care homes as part of the PPE supply chain a lot, I think, quicker than other areas. not entirely in regards to the quantum that we currently had, but also to make those delivery streamlines or those delivery processes a lot easier and a lot more streamlined. It also, I think, allowed us to be more agile in regards to, especially when it came to vaccinations and the vaccination scheme. We were the first part of the United Kingdom able to get vaccines into care homes. We did that on the first day, as well as delivering to the general public as well. So that interconnectedness, although not perfect, I think also strengthened what we were able to do.
All right. I think care homes is a separate topic that I'll come back and ask you about. So some benefits there of integration, but again, in terms of the condition of health and social care services in January 2020, how is it best to characterise those? Is saying that they were extremely precarious or fragile putting it too high, or how would you characterise it?
I don't think that puts it too high at all. I think it was a service that was fragile, it was undervalued, it had been under-supported, and it needed the recognition of an executive actually saying health was a priority that not only we were going to invest in, but we were going to see as a strategic response to what we needed to do across Northern Ireland. So we come back in 20, this is even pre-pandemic, there was a focus on our health service in its entirety to bring it up to standard as where it has been neglected.
All right. I'm going to, sorry, I thought you were going to ask something.
No.
I'm going to move on, if I may, Mr. Swan, to a different but related topic. I'm not going to take you to these documents because I don't think you saw them at the time, but if you do want to see them, I can bring them up on screen. You've addressed them in your witness statement, so these are not new documents. But the inquiry knows that, for example, on the 23rd of January 2020, an official at the Executive Office provided a submission to the TEO addressing a critical lack of resources in the civil contingencies branch in Northern Ireland. Now, first of all, were you aware at the time that there were serious concerns or issues within civil contingencies in Northern Ireland about lack of resource or capability?
I wasn't, my lady, in regards just to I suppose, the extent as to what was actually the challenging point at that stage as well. In regards, I don't know what document you're referring to in regards to that, but there are other documents before we can move off that I would like to refer to in regards to that.
All right, I will ask you about those. I just want to focus on three quite important ones. First of all, to ask if you were aware of them. The other was a futures report that had been written in autumn 2019 that made 85 separate recommendations about civil contingencies capability in Northern Ireland. Do you recall whether or not you were made aware of that whenever you took up office?
That's not a document was ever brought to my attention, and I suppose to acknowledge as well that civil contingencies, that branch CCPBNI actually sits within the Executive Office, not within the Department of Health. So even in the first day brief, I don't think it would have been something that would have been brought to my attention.
All right, and the other document that I wanted to ask you whether you were aware of is a paper that was sent to the TEO Departmental Board in February 2020 that set out to the board that civil contingencies arrangements in Northern Ireland hadn't been reviewed for 20 years and wanted to commission the review to ensure that effective arrangements are in place to enable the executive to support wider citizens and wider society in the event of an unforeseen emergency event or situation.
I wasn't aware at the time. I am now through papers that have been provided to the inquiry.
All right. In terms of, and we'll see obviously that the Department of Health became the lead department very quickly in Northern Ireland in response to the pandemic. It might be thought surprising that you weren't aware or didn't know that there were those concerns about the overarching infrastructure for civil contingencies in Northern Ireland.
My lady, having read this, I suppose coming as a Minister of Health, I always expected those processes, those parts to be in place. They were outside or out with my remit. So there are some, I suppose, worrying and startling facts that have been presented now to me in regards to what was actually the practicality. And I think, my lady, if I do have your permission, in regards to the documents that have been presented as well, there was also an exchange that has come to light in regards to on the 4th of March. I can give a reference number if that's
if
useful.
you perhaps explain what it is that the exchange is that you're referring to.
It's an exchange between Bernie Rooney to Chris Stewart, and then picked up by the head of the civil services, where myself and the chief medical officer actually visit, follow up in regards to what should have been the hub, where the exchange goes. Minister Swan and Dr McBride called in to brief me post Cobra. They're going to contact David Stirling to request ramping up the Northern Ireland hub to support the executive. A response then from David Stirling to Chris Stewart, and this is on the 4th of March, noted thanks. We'll have to be smart about how we respond to this. A flat no to DOH will likely get back to FM and DFN and will be received badly.
Yes.
So it's not only at that stage, my lady, in my remit, it's when when myself and the Chief Medical Officer visited. Now this is the start of March, that there was also an indication that they knew that they weren't match ready at that point, but they were more concerned about actually telling us that they weren't ready, that it would not, that they needed to do something. But that concern would actually get back to FM and DFM.
All right. You've jumped quite a long part ahead.
Apologies.
A long way ahead, because I was going to come back and ask you about that. The chair knows the email to which you were referring because it was put to Sir David Stirling, and I was going to ask you about that and about the point in time when you started perhaps communicating to colleagues that there was a need for a broader stand-up. But I want to go through the picture that was building
Certainly.
before then so that we can put that in context. So I will come back to it, but if we could just maybe take it steadily through the chronology until we get there. And in fact, I wanted to start then with what I think is probably the point in time at which you raised COVID-19 to your officials to ask them about it, because I think it would appear you raised it before anybody raised it with you. But perhaps if I show you that and I can ask you about it. It's INQ 000 425 549. And it's page 4, the last email in the chain. So I think this is the 22nd of January. And it would seem that you're the person asking your officials if they could brief you about COVID-19. And I think then coronavirus, if we could scroll up, please, to the reply. And just slightly up, thank you. And to the reply above, please. I think we can just see, so this is an email from the Chief Medical Officer on the 22nd of January. And I think that he refers to giving you an oral briefing, and then second paragraph says, I fully anticipate we are likely to see suspected and or confirmed cases in the UK and the Republic of Ireland in coming weeks. Restrictions in travel and flights from Wuhan may delay. So, I mean, it would certainly appear from that reply that he was proceeding on the basis that it wasn't a question of if, but when. So there was no question about it. Do you agree?
I agree, yeah.
All right, thank you. That can come down. And I think that you then very quickly, and perhaps this was why you were seeking a briefing, attended Cobra on the 24th of January.
That's correct, yeah, that was the start, yeah.
And perhaps if we just have a look at what was discussed at that. But first, if I could ask you, were you invited to attend Cobra? How does it work in Northern Ireland in terms of involving you in those kind of bodies?
My lady, from my understanding from papers that I've now received and read, the invitation came through to the Executive Office, There was an exchange then between, I'm not sure whether the First and Deputy First Minister were involved, but there's definitely an exchange between the Head of Civil Service, my Permanent Secretary, who suggested I would be the best Minister to attend at that point. So that was how the invitation was extended to me at that point in regards to that first Cobra meeting.
Well, that's really what I wanted to ask you about, that, whether or not it necessarily had to be you or exclusively you, or whether or not, for example, other ministers could have attended alongside you.
I think other ministers could have attended, my lady. I think actually in my statement I say that I think in hindsight it would have been useful that if the invitation had included the First and Deputy First Ministers, even from those early points as well. As we work our way through the pandemic, it was often that I was there along with them at other meetings as well. Whereas, at those early stages, it wasn't about, I think it was solely had to be me. I think the invitation initially came through to CCPB NI and the Executive Office in Hawks in regards, and then it was delegated to me to attend at that point.
So at that stage, Cobra was being chaired by the Health Secretary.
Yes, Matt Hancock,
UK
yes.
government, yes.
Yeah.
All right. So if we just look, please, at the Cobra notes, and that's INQ 000 056 214. If we just look at page 1 to orientate ourselves, we can see that it's Friday the 24th of January. And at this stage, I think a few other ministers were attending alongside, and then other ministers were dialing in. And if we just scroll down a bit, please, and keep scrolling down, please. I think we can see that the first CRIP had been circulated as well, and the escalation paper, yes.
Yeah.
And would you have read those papers beforehand, Mr. Swan, or would your officials have read them? How did it work?
They were shared with the Executive Office, CCPB, and then eventually through my own department as well. So I would have had sight of them. Yeah.
All right, and I think this is probably not controversial, but I think that you were the only minister from Northern Ireland in attendance. I think we can see that if we just carry on scrolling up. Thank you. We can see, I think that those were your counterparts in the other devolved administration. Thank you. And if we just scroll down, please, again. I don't think at that stage anyone else attended, is that right?
That's correct.
It was just you.
It's just us.
And I won't go through the whole of this, but I don't think it's certainly been said that it was highly unusual for ministers from Northern Ireland to be invited to attend Cobra. Is that right?
That's correct.
And how much significance did you attach to the fact, first of all, that Cobra had been instituted, and second, that you had been asked, along with your counterparts, to attend?
At that point, I didn't know it was unusual for Northern Ireland ministers not to attend, especially when a Cobra was called at that point. I've since found out that it was the fact that Scottish and Welsh counterparts were there as well. I did find these, I suppose they were challenging at that stage, my lady, because this was pre-Zoom, pre-online virtual meetings, so we were dialed in, so it was very much, almost felt like we were there as observers to listening to what was going on, rather than actually being full participants as to what was actually happening around the table.
The inquiry has seen that the Northern Ireland Civil Contingency central arrangements appear to foresee that they play a part in Cobra. So in other words, that those arrangements feed into Cobra, and it might be thought, therefore, that they're an analogue to Cobra in Northern Ireland. Did you have any understanding, or had anyone briefed you at that stage about the civil contingencies arrangements in Northern Ireland? I mean, the overarching ones rather than Department of Health ones.
Not so much in regards to the overarching one, but I was aware that there was a CCPB and a TEO official who was in attendance at these meetings. My assumption was that they were there from that section, from TEO, to make sure there was a direct feed in from what was happening in Cobra, because, as you say, that not direct analogy across from Cobra and what was happening, but there was, I suppose, a synergy there.
I don't think anyone from TEO was at that meeting. I think we
No,
see in due course that Miss Rooney starts to attend. But I think just going back to my question, it was asking you if you had any understanding at that time about those central arrangements, or whether or not you would have been dependent, for example, on the TEO informing you about them or informing other ministers about them.
The structure, the invite, from my understanding from the beginning, actually came through TEO in regards to attending these. So that was the formal arrangement in regards to that.
But again, just coming back to whether or not you did have any knowledge about the overarching civil contingencies arrangements. So, for example, the 26 protocol, is that something you would have known anything about?
Not at this initial point in regards to only being in office a matter of days at that point as well, so it wasn't something that was front and centre of a first day brief.
Yes, I think that's really what I wanted to understand, whether or not it was any part of your initial, that first period of time that you had in office, that you would get a briefing about civil contingencies.
Not to the extent of that. There is a part of my first day brief that covers civil contingencies, but not to the extent of overarching structures and how they interact with, especially at Cobra level.
All right. And at this stage, coming towards the end of January, you hadn't been given that briefing?
Not at that point.
All right. Again, I'll come on to deal with what happened as time moved on. I mean, obviously, we've seen from the 2016 protocol, and also I know that there's an emergency response plan that sits within the Department of Health, and that both of those documents set out the concept of a lead department. Was there actually any decision that health would be the lead department, or was it just automatic because this was a potential pandemic situation at that stage?
I think, and again, from the documents, it is about health being the lead department for the health response in regards to a pandemic. So I think that structure was understood, and that's where our emergency response plan kicked in at that point. So there's no designation, and I don't think there is that the Department of Health would lead the executive response, because my lady, I think that would be highly challenging in Northern Ireland for that ability for any health minister, never mind me as an Ulster Unionist health minister, to actually step into the likes of the Department of the Economy and actually start to direct what should be happening there in regards to business supports. So my reading, my belief, and in regards to my understanding is that health was the lead department for the health response.
All right.
In regards to the pandemic,
I think that we'll see that you were the lead department in terms of the 2016 protocol. In other words, you were the lead department for the response to the pandemic. That doesn't mean that you tell other departments what to do, rather that you're generally leading the response. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's in regards to a lead department able to identify and manage the risks in the area of our responsibility. I don't think we would have had the expertise to step into other departments to say, these are the risks you need to be considering specifically in regards to taking it forward. So it's how that overarching piece actually works in regards to tying in a lead department, and we'll go back to our analogies in regards to cabinet. We were talking about Cobra and NICMA. If you look at where the executive office and the cabinet office actually sit, is about that overarching coordination piece.
All right. I think I understand the point that you're making, Mr. Swan. I think the inquiry understands the point that you're making about your limited ability to tell other departments what to do. But I just want to be crystal clear about this, if I may. Do you accept that under the overarching, the central contingencies arrangements for Northern Ireland, that the Department of Health was the lead department for the response to the inquiry? Sorry, for the response to the pandemic.
In regards to as so far what was in our capabilities and within our powers. But I do believe that as I say, when it comes to, I suppose that piece of that recommendation in 2016, it also says there can be more than one lead department in regards to that response to something as serious as the pandemic as well. So it becomes where the lead actually is taken in the overall direction is given from in regards to how actually different departments interact, how different arm's length bodies interact to make sure we have a coordinated response.
Forgive me, maybe I'm not asking the question clearly enough. And again, the inquiry understands that there's not necessarily one lead department, there can be more than one lead department. But in terms of the central contingency arrangement and the provision made for a lead department, do you accept that the Department of Health was the lead department for the response to the pandemic?
And as I've said in regards to the lead department in response for the health outcomes or the health responses to the pandemic, yes, and that's why I believe my officials, my permanent secretary, were engaging with their counterparts as to alerting them of the seriousness of what was coming that we saw from a health point of view, so they could put their responses into place as well, so that they could step up to be and take on their responsibilities and duties.
Yes, I don't think that being the lead department precludes other departments from also exercising their powers or discharging their responsibilities. The concept of a lead department foresees, I think, as it simply says, that department will lead the response and obviously help inform the response across government. Again, do you take any issue with the fact that that's what the Department of Health's role?
I don't take any. I don't take any challenge in regards to that. But what I'm trying to identify what I perceived as our role and remit as lead department, and what our responsibilities were from my understanding at that point.
Just again, coming back to the question of whether or not there was any sort of formal designation or a formal decision that the Department of Health is the lead department under the 2016 protocol, was there ever any such decision or discussion?
Not that I'm aware of, and again, I think in regards to the identification of a lead department, that's a requirement from the Executive Office as well, that they are to designate a lead department, and that formal notification to me or request to me never was made.
Well, look at some of the underlying material that's generated over time about this. And I'm just dealing with the chronology and what happened after the Cobra meeting. The inquiry has seen, and it's been raised in the other modules under Module 2, the email that was sent from Professor Woolhouse to Scotland's Chief Medical Officer. Is that an email that you're familiar with?
It's not one I'm familiar with, apart from Sir Michael's evidence.
Yes, okay. So that Professor Woolhouse had emailed Scotland's Chief Medical Officer in respect of the basic reproduction rate of COVID-19 as provided by WHO and the case fatality rate. And in his email, he set out that if you put those numbers into an epidemiological model for Scotland, you would predict, and he set out predictions about what would happen, and went on to say that the health system would become completely overwhelmed. And he said that these were the ballpark numbers based on information from WHO, and that it wasn't a worst case scenario. And he went on to say that the worst case scenario is considerably worse. Were you aware from your Scottish counterparts that ability to do that sort of modelling and forecast what might happen in Scotland was going on?
I wasn't, my lady, in regards to that specific calculation. I think it wasn't actually until later, I think probably mid-March, that those figures were actually put into a Northern Ireland population in regards to what it could actually mean.
Again, we're probably jumping ahead in time because I'm going to come to the provision of those figures to the Executive Office in March. But can you explain why in Northern Ireland similar exercises weren't going on. Insofar, Scotland appears to have just been using the WHO central estimates and case fatality rate to generate these figures.
I'm not sure as to why, but I do know that, well, I know from watching evidence on Friday that information had been shared with Sir Michael in regards to,
Yes.
to case fatalities, and that there was never, I think, that black and white calculation as to an exact figure that was ever presented to me at that point in time.
Well, I was going to just ask you that, whether or not you were being advised at this time that these were the sorts of figures being provided to Scotland and potentially informing the Scottish response to the pandemic.
I think in regards to, and again, looking back at presentations that were given, I think, by Dr. Chada in regards to expected percentage infection rates to mortality. Early February it was expected, if my memory serves me right, in Dr. Chada's presentations he was talking about, there was talk, and I assume it came from World Health Organization, of a 40% infection rate with a 1% mortality, which changed, I think, towards the start of March, where we were actually looking towards an 80% infection rate and a 1% mortality. So there was, I am aware of those changes in percentages in regards to infection rate, hospitalisation, but I'm not aware that anybody prior to March actually sat down and put that against as a calculation to the Northern Ireland population as to what that would actually mean, that I'm aware of.
Because we've obviously talked about the lack of modelling capability in Northern Ireland, but it's not clear that that would require any modelling necessarily, rather than a calculation based.
No, I don't think that would require the modelling of any regards. But as I say, and I need to be clear, not that was presented to me at that time in regards to that. So I'm not saying that it hadn't been done elsewhere or presented elsewhere within my department.
I think, Mr. Swan, what I'm just focusing on is the advice that was being provided to you and whether it was being conveyed to you at this stage, and I will take it incrementally, but whether or not at this stage at the end of January you were being advised as to the potential, for example, in the way that your Scottish counterpart may have been being advised about the potential, as I say, for health services to be overrun, or for the sorts of strain that the health services in Northern Ireland might be put under?
I think there was an understanding that no matter what level of infection or pressure that COVID was going to bring Milady, that our health service was already under pressure, so anything additional had the potential to look at the collapse of some of our services. So there was a realisation that even at the lower figures that had been presented, that this was going to have a significant, and that's why we instigated, as a department, we instigated our emergency response plan pretty early on in regards to what we needed to be doing and standing up in regards to preparation for that, because we were aware that we had a particularly fragile health service.
All right. So would you say then that from the end of January you were working on the basis that this was an eventuality, and again that health services might be overrun, for example, that you were planning and working towards?
I would say not only that I was doing it, but and the inquiry will be aware that our health service Silver Command had already been stood up on the 22nd of January. Our emergency response plan, and Gold, I think, stood up then about a week later in regards to that. So there was a level of preparation, and to stand up our Gold command is a significant step to take. So there was a realisation across our service in regards to what was going to be necessary. Okay,
I'm going to come back and ask you what was being done, but again, just focusing on this period of time. And we've also seen an email, and I'm not going to bring it up because it wasn't an email sent to you, but again, it's just to ask about your general level of awareness at this point in time, that on the 28th of January, the Chief Medical Officer for the United Kingdom, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, had sent an email to Downing Street, effectively saying that there were two scenarios in play. One was that China would have a major outbreak but be able to control it, or the alternative was that the opposite, effectively, that China would have a major outbreak and not be able to control it. So a dichotomous situation. Again, was that something that you were aware of at the end of January?
I wasn't aware of the email that had been sent to number 10, but I was aware that I think we were preparing for the second scenario, and that's why at the end of January we'd already instigated our health and social care stepped up silver. We'd instigated our emergency response plan in regards to that, but also standing up gold. I think we were preparing for that worst case scenario that China wasn't going to be able to contain it.
So at that point, if there was that appreciation, were you being advised then as to the type of infrastructure that would be required in order to respond to that second scenario? So, for example, the sorts of surveillance that might be required in health services, what capacity for testing there was, what capacity for tracing there was?
Not to that level of detail at that point, but I was aware that our surge plans have been instigated. So, having stood up Health Gold, I'm aware that Sir Michael, as chair of Gold, had already instigated and started those conversations across Health and Social Care Board, Public Health Agency, our BSO, or Business Service Organisations, to make sure that all those parts were aware of their responsibilities, but also the challenges that some of them may face in certain areas.
All right. I'm going to go to a bit of correspondence about the surge plans when we come to it chronologically. But again, if there had been that crystallisation, as it were, at the end of January, did you speak then to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister about that, to make them aware that that was the position or the view that had been taken in the Department of Health? In other words, that you clearly regarded the situation as very serious and were planning accordingly?
I reported to the executive meetings as to the steps that we were taking in regards to health and where COVID actually was in regards to case numbers across the UK as well. But that was also being reinforced, and in my belief, not just at my level as a ministerial level, but also in regards to the engagement that my permanent secretary was having with permanent secretary groups, in regards to the briefing of other departmental officials as well, across all departments.
So you're referring to the meetings that Mr. Pengelly would have with his counterparts, I think, on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll ask you. We've also seen some of those, and I'll ask you about perhaps the message that was being conveyed at that time. Just before we move on, then, you've obviously mentioned the silver response, and the inquiry knows that involved the PHA, and I think the health boards as well. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Were you aware then that issues had been raised about the capability of the PHA to fulfil its statutory duties from 2017 onwards?
Not from 2017 onwards. I am aware, and again through correspondence that has been shared by the inquiry with me last night in regards to challenges of the PHA that were actually there in regards to where they seen. I think from the correspondence that I've seen that they were given a reassurance again to Sir Michael as chair of Gold as to what steps they were going to take to make sure that they were ready for what they were being required to do. Again,
I'm just going to focus on what you knew at that time, and the question was whether, and I think maybe the answer is no, whether you knew that there might be quite serious question marks over the PHA's capabilities.
I wasn't at that particular point.
All right. So again, just taking this chronologically, you attended Cobra then on I think the next meeting was on the 20th of January, a relatively short time later. And perhaps if we just go to the minutes of that, that's at INQ 000 056 226. And again, just briefly at page 1, I think there's now a much greater body of ministers in attendance. And if we go, please, to page 3, I think we see that from Northern Ireland, the Chief Medical Officer is there. And I think it's right that Miss Rooney was also there. If we could just look at paragraph 1, please. So I think here, being conveyed that there was human-to-human transmission, and that it was certainly in Germany. And I think if we could just go down, please. And to paragraph 3. So again, I think the mention there of the sort of dichotomous eventualities, yes.
Yep.
And then at paragraph 6, please. That government should prepare for the reasonable worst case scenario, and that there should be a ministerial tabletop exercise in the following fortnight. And again, we'll come back and deal with that exercise. But again, were you clear? Thank you, that can come down. Were you clear, or did you understand the message being conveyed by government at that time to be a reinforcement of that message that the situation was becoming ever more serious?
It was in regards to, you talk about the dichotomy there, and if you get back to that paragraph, it says, it will take weeks or months.
Yes.
Prior to that. So there was that, I think it's been described as that rising tide awareness of what was potentially going to happen.
All right, but I think going back to my question, whether or not you regarded that as a reinforcement of the message that this was becoming increasingly serious.
And it was, but it's still come back to, as you presented, that dichotomy as to what the two scenarios were that were contained in China or not contained in China. And I think at that point there's a realisation that this, or an acceptance that it's no longer going to be contained in China, because the minutes already indicate there was 4 cases in Germany.
I think that after this meeting, and again we've seen internal email correspondence about this, that you asked if the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister had been briefed, and just coming back to that, I don't think we've seen any briefings to the ministers before then. Would that tend to suggest that you hadn't spoken to the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister about COVID by that stage?
No, I think, sorry, the date of that
That's the 29th of January.
Well, I'd already, we'd already, I think, raised it at an executive meeting in regards to that in general conversations. I think it would be part of a general conversation that I would have had, and they would have been aware of what other steps were being taken. I think my point in raising that was, has FM and DFM been briefed, is the fact that are they receiving, it was more a question from my point of view, are they receiving the same information that I have? Because at that point I didn't know of the structures of papers or the flow of papers that were actually coming through the Executive Office.
I think the first meeting of the Executive Committee was on the 2nd of February, so I didn't think there had been a meeting by that stage. But I suppose just putting aside the question of briefing, in terms of the sort of relationship that you had with the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, was it the sort of relationship where you would go and informally speak to them about things like this, or was there a greater formality to communications with them and your relationship with them?
At that point in time, there would have been a greater formality, because again, it's the 29th of January, we were only re-established as an executive a few weeks prior to that, so there wasn't the interaction that we later developed. And again, that's why I was able to say, my lady, that I thought I had good support from the First and Deputy First Minister, because we had that. I believe that relationship where there was an open exchange of views and conversations.
All right. So again, just coming back then to the chronology and why at that particular time you thought that they should be, or were asking, had they been briefed. Again, can we take it that that's because of the increasing understanding that this would require for a significant scale of response from government in Northern Ireland?
Very much so, but also, I suppose the question I was asking at that point is to make sure that I was satisfied myself that they were receiving the same information coming out of those Cobra meetings.
All right, and we'll go back to that. My lady, I think it's time for a break.
Certainly. We shall break until 11:30. I hope you were warned Mr Swan about breaks. Afraid it's a long day for you, but we will complete today, I promise.
Thank you.
Stop.
Thank you, my lady. So, Mr Swan, I think before that short adjournment, we had just gotten to about the end of January 2020. And we've gone through what your state of understanding was by that point. And I think we're probably agreed, or at least it appears on the face of the documents, first of all, that there hadn't been any meeting of ministers in Northern Ireland at that stage. I think you're nodding, that's correct. And it doesn't appear that there had been any sort of formal or minuted meeting between you and the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister to discuss COVID-19 either.
Correct,
Is that correct? And putting that to one side and putting formality to one side, do you recollect having any discussions with them at this stage about COVID-19, or maybe even any discussions with them at all, or would you have been doing quite separate things?
No, there would have been discussions. As I said, at that point in time, the main thrust was actually bringing our health service workers out of industrial action. So there was joint press conferences in regards to doing that. So I can't honestly recall if COVID was discussed as at those points as well. But if you're pointing there is no formal record of a formal meeting had at that point in time towards the end of January. There's none that I'm aware of.
And just again, in terms of just understanding how you were being advised about the pandemic, obviously as time moved on, there was a much greater proliferation of papers and advice. Yes. SAGE advice, SPIMO papers, all of that. Were you reading those yourself, or were those papers being synthesised for you, or were you receiving oral briefings? How was that information being conveyed?
When it comes to those SAGE or SPIM that you're talking, those were being synthesised through Chief Medical Officer's office in regards to his support staff, and the briefing notes that I would have had them pre-Cobra or even pre-executive meetings were that document that I was working from. And as you already indicated, that request that I had made, can't I have a briefing? Chief Medical Officer indicated there was already one on its way to me at that point.
Again, sorry, I'm just trying to understand, because we've seen some of the written briefings, whether or not the information was principally conveyed in writing to you, or whether or not you would have received oral briefings, or was it a combination?
It would have been a combination of both, based on those papers, as well as regards to, if a paper came in that would have been backed up with engagement with the Chief Medical Officer before attending, especially the Cobra meetings, because the two of us were joining those together.
Again, I'm going to just take it chronologically. As far as the inquiry can see, the first time that the Executive Committee met since power sharing resumed was on the 3rd of February. I may have said the 2nd of February earlier, but it was the 3rd of February. And we know that COVID-19 was listed under any other business rather than constituting a subject of its own at that stage. Does that reflect that it wasn't regarded as a principal issue at that time, or why would it have only come under any other business?
That would be for the Secretariat of the Executive, but I don't think we should read too much into the fact that it was where it sat on the agenda. It was the fact that it was on the agenda and was being talked about, and we were able to raise it and have those conversations in regards to that.
All right. I'm just going to look, if I may, with you at the briefing for that meeting that you were provided with. And this is INQ 000 425 586, please. The inquiry has seen this, Mr. Swan, but we can see it's addressed to you and the CMO. And we can see, can't we, that it's a briefing for the Executive Committee meeting. And if we go over the page, please. It would appear that you were being provided, as it were, with an date, for example, as to the number of infections across the world and the number of deaths as well, correct?
Yes.
And we see there reference to the fact that of the announcement that had been made on the 30th of January, yes,
Yeah.
it was a public health emergency of international concern. Thank you. And at 4, reference also to the fact that cases were now being seen in England as well. Yes?
Yes. Sorry.
No, don't worry. And I think if we can see as well, we don't need to go to this, but reference to there having been 2 tests in Northern Ireland. And if we could go to page 7, please. These were your lines to take. And we can see it too. I want to reassure colleagues that while the risk has been raised from low to moderate, we saw reference to that, didn't we, paragraph 3, that it was no cause for alarm. Didn't mean that risk to individuals had changed, but we should plan for all eventualities. So in terms of the significance that you attached to the raising of the risk to low to moderate, does that paper reflect what you understood?
It does, but, and again, my lady, probably with the benefit of hindsight, where I understood the raising of risk from low to moderate was the fact that we'd already instigated our silver command and we're starting to go through our structures. I think maybe a weakness was that there wasn't an explanation or an understanding what actually moving to moderate means in regards to possibly the strength of what, maybe in my feeling, and what I was explaining that to my executive colleagues, and actually what it meant that we should plan for all eventualities. But in regards to that, there was also those, the further briefings that the permanent secretaries were having, the chief medical officer or the deputy chief medical officer was providing as well. So if there's a feeling at that point in regards to how strong a position I was positioning my lady, I think it's that understanding for others as to what it actually meant by moving to low to moderate, because that is quite a significant step. Yes. And the crux of it being that we should plan for all eventualities, I actually think is the key line in that.
But again, if I can unpick this, I mean, first of all, Mr. Swan, this was advice that was being provided to you, wasn't it?
Yes.
Rather, you've said maybe it's my fault, but this was what you were being told you should convey to colleagues, correct? By your expert advisors.
That's correct, but I'm sorry, and I think what I mean in that, my lady, is maybe that, I didn't, or the understanding of what moderate meant maybe wasn't strongly enough conveyed to executive colleagues. It may have been disseminated through their permanent secretaries and other standings as to actually what that meant, but around the executive table, and I think it was our first executive meeting since restoration, so I'm sure ministers' heads were in other places as well, having just picked up their own portfolios.
But of course, but again, and I'm not, this has been approached on the basis this was advice to you as to what you should convey. I suppose, first of all, whether or not how this is put is also how you understood it. Yes. In other words, that raising it to moderate didn't necessarily change the dial very much.
But it should have meant, sorry, and again, it's looking at that point in time with what I know now, it should have been not changing the dial, but it should have been actually telling people to be prepared to turn the dial up in regards. Yeah. We've moved from low to moderate. Get ready for the next step, I think, was what should have been portrayed at that point. It's
useful to have reflections on how things were, looking at it now and perhaps saying this could have been sounding alarm bells to a much greater degree. And it's helpful that you're doing that. But again, I just want to focus, and I don't want to inhibit you from doing that, but I just want to focus for a moment on what this might have conveyed, first of all, to you, Mr. Swan, and then, of course, to your colleagues. But, I mean, do you accept that framing it in this way wasn't sufficient and didn't didn't make it clear enough why changing to moderate was significant.
Yeah, and I think that's, sorry, apologies, my lady, if I'm not betraying, I think that's where that step up, where it is significant in retrospect, but whether it was being conveyed at that point in time. But I think it is important to, again, to stress just that last part of that bullet point, that we should start to plan for all eventualities. I think that's the point that should have been, I suppose, reinforced and really driven home.
But I wonder as well, Mr. Swan, telling people to plan for all eventualities, and particularly ministers who may not, most of whom I know that it's not correct of the Deputy First Minister, but who may have no background in the Department of Health or understanding how a response to a pandemic works. That might not necessarily mean a great deal to tell them to plan for all eventualities. That's quite different from saying we're facing a very significant risk and here are the things we really need to be thinking about now. Do you accept that?
I do, but I also think it reflects back to that exchange at the Executive Office. Maybe you'll come on to that in regards to where it was said that Northern Ireland was 18 months behind and prepared for those civil contingencies and aspects outside health. So in regards to the preparing for all eventualities, it's where that gap had maybe been established, that there could have been an alarm bell ringing at that stage. Go back to your departments and make sure that gap is closed, or at least being tried to be closed.
I think we'll come, I don't want to shut you out from making that point, but I think again, as we go on and consider how the picture developed, I think that we will be able to come back to that question of whether or not there was sufficient understanding on the part of other departments. And again, just trying to understand, we're now at the start of February. What was being done in Northern Ireland at this point, either to prevent, for example, transmission into Northern Ireland or transmission amongst the public in Northern Ireland? Were there any steps that were being taken to address that, rather than, for example, surge planning in the event that it happened?
Not in regards that were Northern Ireland specific, in regards to prevention of, I suppose, people coming to our shores in regards to that, because of it being an undevolved issue in regards to international travel. So in regards, it was a bit preparation, it was a bit discussion, it was about their surge plans and making sure that we were getting ready for what potentially may come.
So that's obviously addressing what may come. But does that mean that there was, again, just in terms of what you knew, what might be being done to stop it coming in the first place to Northern Ireland, or to try and inhibit transmission when it arrived?
I don't think there was any preparation being done across these islands, my lady, in regards to the ability to stop it coming here. And again, there was the two scenarios that were painted earlier on in regards to China would contain it or it would become worldwide. So I think in that recognition, we were moving towards the second part as well. But in regards to preparing, I suppose, Northern Ireland for the prevention of what could actually happen, I think our focus was mainly on preparing health service for it, rather than actually wider preparation for what became, our non-pharmaceutical interventions and MPIs, as they spoke about.
So obviously the inquiry understands that Northern Ireland had no power to unilaterally shut its border or anything like that. But does that mean that you were proceeding on the basis that it was just inevitable that it was going to arrive on Northern Ireland shores in due course?
Well, I think there was an acceptance that there was going to be when, not if, in regards to that.
All right. Now, just trying to focus then on what actually was being done. You've referred, I think, to the fact that surge planning was going on. And I think that we see, and perhaps if I can take you to this, INQ 000 137326. The inquiry has seen this already, Mr. Swan, and I think it has been provided to you as well. And it's a letter from the Chief Medical Officer. I think we understand that Miss Watts was from one of the health boards, is that right?
Miss Watts was actually Chief Executive of Health and Social Care Board and PHA at that time.
Right. So in other words, I think the person who would then be operationally responsible for your silver arrangements. And I think, I won't read out all of this, Mr. Swan, but I think we can see that the CMO wanted to know about what the arrangements would be for the command and control arrangements at silver level. Yes?
Yes.
And sorry, I should have said before I went any further, this is the 17th of February, isn't it? Thank you. And if we just scroll down a bit, we can see that he was raising capacity within the PHA. And if we could scroll down, please. And we can see, I'm just moving on, having raised the question of PHA capability, he refers there to surge planning. And the fact that robust modelling would take some time. Do you see that, Mr. Swan?
Yep.
And then I think the third paragraph, that he was seeking details of surge planning to be provided by the 13th of March. Correct?
Yes.
And I think it's right, isn't it, that when those surge plans initially were provided to the Department of Health, they were deficient and had to be, I think, had to be the subject of or sent for much more or much greater detailed consideration. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So again,
I'm not sure. I know it says by the 13th of March at latest. I'm not sure if they were presented actually earlier than that.
Well, I think when I'm sure we can find the date for you, but again, I think the issue may be that when they were provided, it would appear that PHA and the health boards were not capable of providing the sort of surge planning that the Department of Health expected. Is that correct?
That would be correct from conversations with the Chief Medical Officer. He challenged those again.
And again, just trying to understand where this fits in terms of the planning. This is being sought on the 17th of February. So that's obviously a number of weeks down the line. Is this, as you understand it, the first substantive step that was taken towards surge planning in Northern Ireland?
Well, in regards to that, the formal request coming from Chief Medical Officer as Chair of Gold, yes, that, the first documented requests of those specifics that I have seen, but already stepped up silver and instigated an emergency response plan which asks for those surge plans to develop. So it's the chronological order of that.
So why would that have required the CMO to ask for plans?
Because he is Chair of Gold.
Yeah, sorry, I'm probably misunderstanding. Do you mean that there had been an initial request for plans?
That's what I'm saying. And I don't know if there had been a request, but I think this is him interacting. If we go back to the start of that document, again, I only received it this morning in regards to that, and there's a follow-up from a meeting actually on the 11th. Of February from what I received from that. So that seems to be the initial engagement that he had at that point.
All right. But yes, I think we can see that, can't we? That there had been that initial meeting. Yeah. And I think, in fact, the inquiry has seen reference to that already, that it was a follow-up from that on the 11th of February, and this was the request. But again, the fact that he was seeking plans and asking for them to be provided by the 13th of March, at the latest, might suggest that, that doesn't speak to urgency about the need to have these surge plans in place.
But I think it possibly speaks to the detail that was required, the fact that he asked for them to get back again, from my understanding, and what you've said here as well. So when they did come in at that point, that he challenged them to get back again to make sure they were fit for purpose at that time.
All right. So other than this, what's set out in this letter, What were the other aspects of the response in Northern Ireland at this point, say in mid-February?
In regards to, I suppose, the interactions from my own department, I do know the department secretary, as I said earlier, had alerted permanent secretary stakeholder group in regards to making sure they were to get ready as well. I'd made an urgent written statement, I think as you referred to earlier on as well, to the Assembly to make sure there was a public awareness of what was being done and what was expected as well. So in regards to that as well, I'm also aware from, and I suppose from executive papers, maybe jumping a bit further into February, was that paper to the TEO Executive Board in regards to their concerns about the executive in Northern Ireland not being prepared.
All right, I'm going to come back and just try and deal chronologically with things then, because I think that, and again, I'm going back in time a bit. Okay. Jumped ahead to the 17th of February, but you went to a Cobra meeting on the 5th of February. And again, I just wanted to bring that up, please. That's INQ 000 056 215. And again, I think we can see a host of ministers present, Mr. Swan. And if we could just go over the page, please. We can see that, again, you've dialed in with your counterparts. And if we could just check, again, if we could scroll down, please. Yes, so I think at this meeting, there wasn't anyone from the TEO. I hope you'll take that from me. Yeah, I've checked. I can't see that there was. But the Chief Medical Officer did attend. And I think if we could just look, please, at page 5 and paragraph 2. I think, Mr. Swan, this is a reflection of the growing information that was now available. And we can see, for example, that the two most high-risk groups appear to be the elderly and those with pre-existing illnesses, and that the fatality rate remained at 2 to 3%. Yes?
Yes.
So, sorry, and if we could just please go to page 8. I think it's the final bullet on page 8. Yes, so again, I just want to pick this up. Again, reference there to the invitation to the upcoming ministerial exercise. Yes?
Yes.
Now, the inquiry has already heard from senior officials in Northern Ireland that they did understand through information that was coming from UK central government that China had in fact lost control of the virus at that stage. Was that also your understanding?
Not clearly at that point in time in regards to any briefing that I received in regards to that. We were all seeing what was happening on our TVs and across the world, but there was I don't think there was any direct paper or alert to say China's lost control in regards to where it is. All
right, so whatever understanding or information they had, that wasn't shared or provided?
Not that I can recall.
All right, and if we could just stay on this document, please, and go back to page 6 as well. We can see, Mr. Swan, the planning for a reasonable worst-case scenario. Yes?
Yes.
And again, I'm not going to read out all of it, but we can see that you must have been provided with slides about planning work that was going on around that. Yes?
Yes.
And then I just wanted to pick up at paragraph 11 that the chair said it was appropriate for all departments to privately engage with trusted partners on the reasonable worst-case scenario planning assumptions. Yes?
Yes.
And again, reference to the ministerial tabletop exercise, which again we'll come back to. And again, just to finish this off at page 8, please, and paragraph 7. Yes, sorry, it's page 7. We can see that paragraph 7 said all departments to rapidly advance planning for the reasonable worst case scenario, centrally coordinated by the Civil Contingencies Secretariat. Yes.
Yeah.
Mr. Swan, thank you, that can come down. Did you understand in terms of the planning that was going on at central government level and that instruction that all departments should start to prepare their planning, that was something that equally should be being done in Northern Ireland as well?
My assumption would have been that there was cross-communication as well, rather than just what was being conveyed at Cobra, that when it come to several contingencies and the request for that to happen, that there would have been read across into the executive office as well, rather than just a simple reliance on that set of minutes and the request coming from it.
All right, so just to be clear about that, you would have taken it as read. It didn't require Cobra to say that.
Yeah.
It should have been happening in Northern Ireland in any event.
Well, in regards to if that was what was happening in the discussions at Cobra, there should have been a read across in
I
regards
have
to that.
misunderstood then. So even though it appears that no one from Northern Ireland other than you and the CMO was at that meeting, that nonetheless there should have been an awareness in Northern Ireland that was the position.
Yep, because my understanding, those papers again were still being shared through the CCPB-NI, so they were picking up in regards to the civil contingencies response.
And again, to my second point, whether or not that should have been taken as a given in Northern Ireland by this stage anyway, that sort of departmental planning should be going on. Is that also your position?
That would have been my assumption and my understanding, but no, in hindsight, my lady, maybe it was an assumption too far in regards to some points in regards to that.
Now, we know, and it's a letter that the inquiry has seen many times, that on the 6th of February, an official from the Department of Health advised officials in the TEO that it wasn't necessary to activate the NICMA arrangements unless and until the infection appears in Northern Ireland and its impacts were experienced in Northern Ireland. So I suppose the first question is whether or not you were aware that officials from your department were providing that advice to TEO.
I wasn't at that point.
And is that advice that you would have agreed with or thought that your department ought to be giving to TEO?
At that point in time, again, my lady, from the understanding of the briefings that I've received in regards to what the department thought was necessary, no, it wasn't necessary to stand up NICMA at that point. And you've heard from Richard Pengelly in regards to the Permanent Secretary's point of view, but also from the Chief Medical Officer's point of view. I do go on, my lady, and actually say in my own statement that there was a potential gain we could have had if we'd have stood up NICMA. I think I would reflect on where David Sterling actually said, you know, if we'd have stood up NICMA slightly earlier, it may have raised the red flag to those other departments that as of that point actually hadn't taken up the baton at that point in time. And apologies if I've jumped forward again on you.
You have jumped. You've jumped forward a little bit, but again, I suppose that the real issue here, Mr. Swan, is the fact that the Department of Health was actually giving that information, giving that advice. So rather than, as it were, raising the red flag and saying, you really need to be clear the position that has been reached, we have the Department of Health saying or advising, we don't think that the protocol needs to be stood up.
And I think in that regards, from my analysis and from my point of view, it was advice. It's not to be taken by NICMA or CCPB-NI as a direct instruction not to stand it up. It still falls within the remit of, and I think the inquiry has heard, my lady, that there's a number of options as to who can actually instigate NICMA or when it should be stood up or under what conditions it's stood up. So rather than, I think, CCPB-NI or TEO officials taking that as a direct instruction not to, I think there's an opportunity where they could possibly have used their own initiatives in regards to when NICMA could be stood up. NICMA was stood up, I think, prior to that in 2017 for Stormophilia, my lady.
They're not likely, forgive me for interrupting, but they're not likely to go against the advice of the Department of Health in a health emergency, are they, Mr Swan, to be fair?
To be fair, my lady, probably not, but there is an opportunity, I think, where they could have, if they were getting other indications from other departments, that there was a possibility that Nimbus should be or could be stood up in regards to pressures coming from other areas. You know, and again, it's only through engaging with the papers that I think there was a request, or at least an indication, that came from the Permanent Secretary of Education in regards to that. So I think from a Department of Health point of view, it was more in regards to timing, in regards to when it would be most appropriate to be stood up.
I've consulted you about that.
Potentially, my lady, yes, in regards to that, and again in regards to the advice and guidance that I've, and my lady, if the advice and guidance coming from my Permanent Secretary and the Chief Medical Officer was that it was premature to stood it up, after challenging them and interrogating and asking them, I may, in all likelihood, have probably agreed with the both of them.
But at least you had a chance to challenge and test.
Yes.
So they should have asked you. It's not just potentially, they should have asked you.
In regards to, and again, I'm at the level of that correspondence at that point of time, I don't know if it wasn't being brought to my attention.
I think this comes back to a point I asked you at the start, Mr Swan, about your understanding of civil contingencies arrangements in that 2016 protocol, and whether or not you would have understood by this stage what those arrangements were and what potentially the role of the Department of Health was in them.
And I think it goes back to that early point in regards to, from the first day brief, in regards to the role in civil contingencies, which, you know, and I think that has been provided to the inquiry as well, which actually says about the Department of Health being the lead for health-related issues.
But I suppose, sorry, forgive me, I just mean...
no, it doesn't go into the detail of activation of NICMA or CCPB and their role and responsibility, or actually who can instigate NICMA as well. I'm not even sure if that was contained in other first day briefs either.
Do you think at this stage there was actually a lack of clarity as to who was responsible for what in government in Northern Ireland in response to this unfolding?
I do, and I think the more that I've read into this and the more I've listened over the past few days in regards to that as well, I think there is a misunderstanding as to who can take that coordination control, that overarching, that umbrella almost view of what's being done across all departments. I think it is clear. I think it is delineated in NICMA in regards to who can take the responsibilities, whether they were taken by the appropriate people. I think TEO and the Executive Office, where CCPB NI actually sits, I'm not sure we're actually stepping forward to assume their command and control, their oversight control even, in regards to what needed to be done on a Northern Ireland-wide basis, rather than solely seeing the COVID pandemic through the prism of it being a health issue.
Yes.
That was going to be solely maintained within health, but as we now know, it expanded into every aspect of government in Northern Ireland and every aspect of human life.
And again, I'm just focusing for the moment on the message perhaps that officials in your department were giving at that time. And I wonder if we could go to INQ 000 254 430. And again, the inquiry has seen this, Mr Swan. It's not a letter from you, it's a letter from the Chief Medical Officer. And I think that this relates back to the Cobra meeting and the idea that trusted partners should be told about getting planning assumptions in place for the reasonable worst case scenario. Is that what you think about this letter, that's what it relates to?
That's my understanding, and if I'm incorrect again from what I've read, my lady, it was the request from CCBPNI that the Chief Medical Officer actually drafted that letter for circulation using his knowledge and experience as to what was required coming out of that Cobra meeting.
And I think we see here in terms of who it's addressed to, and again, sorry, just focusing on the date, again, it's the 6th of February 2020. It's to all Northern Ireland departments for onward distribution to all public authorities. So, first of all, it doesn't appear to be restricted to trusted partners, so to speak. I'm not sure what trusted partners means. I don't know if you do.
I'm not aware of the phrase having any standing in Northern Ireland, Melanie.
No. But do you agree this letter was, I mean, it's unequivocal, isn't it? It is to all public authorities. And I think that we've seen, I won't go through this whole letter with you, Mr. Swan, but if we go to paragraph 20, so the advice being given to all public authorities in Northern Ireland, that those that already have contingency plans for infectious diseases such as pandemic influenza should ensure that all relevant staff are acquainted with them. And then at 21, thank you, no other action is recommended at this time to public authorities in general. I mean, Mr. Swan, just looking at that, obviously it doesn't begin to deal with reasonable worst-case scenarios or planning assumptions, does it?
No, but again, it is the start of February in regards to the timeline of that, and I suppose it's based on the understanding of where COVID may actually be at that point in time in regards to the seriousness in regards to that, in regards to the infection and also the effects of it in regards to when it actually arrives in Northern Ireland. But I think it's clear there in regards to that, and as you say, it's not a letter that I sent out, but it clearly says it should, and all public authorities should ensure that all relevant staff are acquainted with the plans, and those are plans for infectious diseases and pandemic influenza, because at that stage, I think, whether I'm probably incorrectly, we were still working on the basis that pandemic flu preparedness plans were going to be the key building block of our response.
I mean, what about the public authorities that didn't have any such plans? I mean, there's nothing to tell them that maybe they should think about getting them. I mean, it's premised on getting organisations with plans to get their staff to have a look at them.
I can't comment on that in regards to what was included in this letter, but I suppose again it depends on the circulation list as to who it was going to, in regards to was there an expectation that they would have those plans in place. Well, I can't comment to that at this.
I think it's going to all public authorities, and I think given the way this is written, those public authorities that already have the plans would suggest that it was understood that they might not all have plans. In terms of paragraph 21, no other action is recommended at this time. Again, this was going to all public authorities in Northern Ireland. Do you have concerns about that?
In regards to, I suppose at that point in time in early February, it wouldn't have been a concern at that time. And again, it's putting things into perspective, milady, in regards to time of when the letter was actually written and circulated, in regards to what other actions public authorities may have been able to take in regards to being prepared for a pandemic at that point.
I mean, again, do you agree that in terms of highlighting to public authorities that there's this building picture of concern and a need to really make sure that they are planning for this possible eventuality, that this isn't really, again, raising any kind of flag to them?
It wouldn't be raising a flag, but again, taking it, and again, it's not a letter
No, of course.
I drafted, I circulated, I'd sight of prior to the inquiry. So the point in time, point of inflection, the general context as to where we are, whether the paragraph is even needed at that point in time, maybe a reflection in regards to it to the author may make at this point, my lady.
All right. Well, we'll carry on, if we may, just looking at how this developed. Just going back for a second to the Cobra meeting, obviously it was flagging up, wasn't it, as well, the concern that elderly people and those with existing illnesses might be, or certainly appear to be, more vulnerable to COVID-19 as well. And do you recollect whether or not that understanding was informing what the Department of Health was doing at that time, and if so, what it was?
I do know in regards to that specific issue, there was general, I suppose, guidance, high-level guidance sent out to care homes towards the end of February in regards to that from chief social worker and chief nurse, if I'm correct, but I can check on that in regards to, again and again, it goes back to that point of preparing your plans for flu, influenza, those pandemic preparedness that a lot of care homes and care home providers would already have had in place, not at a high level, but again for influenza outbreaks and other outbreaks as well.
Okay. As I said, we will have a look at care homes and maybe in a little bit more detail and as a specific topic. But just following on, so we've seen the Cobra meeting and the exhortation perhaps that all departments should start planning on their reasonable worst case scenario basis. I think it's right then that after that, a few days later, there was an executive meeting. And perhaps if we could just have a look at the handwritten note. That's INQ 000 065 706. I think we can see this is the 10th of February. And I should say, Mr. Vaughan, we don't have the handwritten notes from the 2nd of February. So this is the first point at which we can, as it were, pick up what was being conveyed to ministers. And I think that if we could go to page 5, please. So I think that this was the information that was given to ministers via you. And I think if we could please just scroll down a little. And then we see there, I'm just looking at the final couple of lines, Mr. Swan, risk level moderate, but not complacent, working hard in the background. Accepting, of course, that this handwritten note may not set out everything that you say, it nonetheless looks like a fairly short update, and certainly perhaps a fairly generalised one at that point.
I think, my lady, as I said earlier, it was only through the inquiry that I became aware that these notes were actually being taken and retained. So I can't speak to whether that was a reflection as to what was actually said, the duration, whether it's the highlights of what was actually said rather than actually a verbatim minute of what was said. So whether it's all that I presented at that time, I can't recall. No. But if that's the note that has been taken as the highlights that are there. But I also think it goes back to, if you get back to the first point, though it actually indicates in the first page that I may be leaving the executive meeting to attend a COVID briefing. Yes. I think should also indicate to those who were attendants at that meeting that it was a serious enough issue that I was leaving the executive meeting to go and receive COVID briefings.
But again, just coming back to the point we discussed, or that you stated a little while ago about perhaps not, that it wasn't being conveyed to your colleagues quite how significant a development it was, that the risk had gone up to moderate. We can see that it is mentioned here, and I think these were the words that I wanted to ask you about, working hard in the background, which must be obviously a reference to what the Department of Health was doing. But just the idea that it's working in the background, that would suggest that, again, this isn't a prominent issue. COVID-19 isn't in the foreground of what the Executive Committee is
But I think that's an update as to what. Sorry, and again, it's taken that, I suppose, one sentence of a handwritten note and putting it into context, working hard in the background, and again in regards to the preparation for the Coronavirus Act. There was a lot of work being done in the background between departments to make sure that they were actually prepared for the powers that would be required or the actions that would be required in the general in regards to that, a big cross-departmental work. So I can't, unfortunately, put that into context.
Of course, and I don't want to pick over tiny, words and isolated words, but I think that this is something that you say in your statement, and it's obviously a very important point, and we will come back to it once we've moved on in the chronology a bit. But this idea that the response at this time was very much seen as being a matter for the Department of Health as opposed to other departments. Do we see here the sort of nutshell of that, or an early indication of that?
I'm not sure that does at that point in time, because, as I say, my lady, in regards to the development of the Coronavirus Act, it was very much about working across departments to see what they needed put into it to make sure they were happy with it. And again, that was taken under the urgent procedure through the executive. So executive colleagues were aware of it. And again, that may be, and I don't recall this handwritten transcript, but that may be an opening statement. And then the way these meetings usually worked, my lady, I remember the First Minister, Arlene Foster, referring to them at one point as, now we'll move into the Ask Robin section, because it did move actually out into a quite engaging conversation in regards to what was happening, in regards to what we were doing, what other departments were doing.
We can scroll down and see what the discussion was. And if so, there doesn't seem to have been much from the First Minister. Deputy First Minister, keep us up to date, yes. And we move on to different topics. So, it does seem to have been, certainly you may have briefed them, but any discussion thereafter, going by the notes, would appear to have been quite limited.
But, and again, I wasn't aware of those notes or how much of a verbatim record they actually are.
All right. So I think in time then you attended the exercise that we've seen reference to on a couple of occasions, the Operation Nimbus exercise. And from your statement, you said that you have no real memory of that exercise at all. Is that right?
That is correct, my lady. When I was drafting my statement, it wasn't something that was actually in any recollection that I had. And when I look back as to the actions that were taken out of it, I think it was at such a level that I didn't. That's possibly why I didn't actually remember at that point actually having been at it.
And can we assume from that you obtained no benefit or particular insight from it?
I honestly, and this may sound blunt, but I found no beneficial takeaway from it that it actually made it stick out in my memory as having an impact or an effect or any benefit to the things that was happening in Northern Ireland.
And did it generate any papers within your department or any learning points? Or
I think there was notes that flowed from it, but there was no actual takeaway learning points that actually came out of it in regards to it.
All right. So just coming back then to the legislation that and the paper that you provided in respect of that. I think we have that at INQ 000 390 947. So I think, again, this is what you're referring to, I think, Mr. Swan, in terms of this, the introduction of this bill, as it were, helping to inform your ministerial colleagues about the position that was presenting itself. And is it your evidence that this ought to have been a moment, perhaps, when the penny dropped for other ministers as to the gravity of the situation?
I think that would be a very accurate description as to where I saw the importance actually of this bill. This was UK-wide draft legislation that I was asking other ministers, and even just a paragraph 2. Minister for Education, Finance, Justice have confirmed to me that they're content with the clauses as drafted. So to me it was already saying, well, it was saying to me there's a major piece of legislation that has been brought forward as to how the UK will actually respond to the coronavirus, and I've already had input from those other ministers. For those other ministers to say they're content with the clauses would, to me, I know within the Department of Health, my lady, I wouldn't be saying I'm happy with those clauses for emergency legislation without having had an understanding as to what they were going to mean to my department, and also the responsibilities they were going to bring at a legislative point of view. I would also say, this is still early February, so the executive is still weeks old at this point, when I'm asking not just the First and Deputy First Minister to proceed with this through urgent procedure, but also other ministers for a very quick and rapid input into it.
So I think we can see here reference to you taking the lead because it's a cross-cutting issue. I think that's specific to this piece of legislation, isn't it?
Yes.
So you're effectively sponsoring the legislation. And I think it's correct that what you were inviting them to do was effectively to, and forgive me if I'm not accurate about this, but you were effectively saying that the regulations that would apply in Northern Ireland would be those that were going to be applied in England, but amended where they needed to be Northern Ireland specific. Is that right?
Well, it was a UK-wide piece of legislation,
Yes.
and there are certain clauses within that bill would have specific responsibility to education, finance, justice, and they, from recollection and from reading this, that we'd actually written to them with the paragraphs or clauses that we thought were relevant to their role, their remits and their responsibilities, to ask them to make sure that they were content with the inclusion of those, not just those clauses within the bill, but also the effect that they would have in Northern Ireland.
All right. And if we can just go to paragraphs 3, 4 and 5, please. So again, reference to you as the lead government department. I think that, again, that's a reference to you being, well, I was going to say, I thought that was a reference, in fact, to the response to Covid-19. I mean, that's what the sentence says, correct?
In collaboration with other executive departments,
I don't want to quibble.
Okay.
But it does say the Department of Health as lead government department in collaboration. I'm not suggesting for a moment, Mr. Swan, that this was entirely on your shoulders. I think it's just important that there's clarity that the Department of Health was the lead government department, correct? And you've set out that your department continued to work closely with relevant authorities. And again, reference to the fact that there had been that declaration on the 30th of January, as we've already seen, appropriate to plan for a reasonable worst-case scenario. Yes?
Yes.
And then again, I think at 5, updating your ministerial colleagues about the number of cases, yes?
Yes.
And that there had been spread into the United Kingdom as well, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And I think that's fine. Thank you very much. Can I just, Mr. Swan, just at this point in time, it doesn't appear that the Executive Office had any other form of advice on the clinical or the medical or the health aspects of the pandemic other than that which you were providing to them. And I think you were also conveying, obviously, the advice that you were receiving from officials in the Department of Health. Is that your understanding as well?
Well, in regards to, I'm aware there was correspondence, again, we've mentioned it, between my permanent secretary and other permanent secretaries in regards to what they needed to be doing as well. There was also, and I think, sorry, again, jumped on, was that letter from the TEO board in regards to the executive in Northern Ireland being prepared as well.
Yes. Sorry, forgive me if I'm not being clear enough. The question was whether or not you accept that your department was the primary provider of information and advice to the TEO and indeed to other departments about first of all, the response to the pandemic and the clinical picture about the pandemic as well.
No, I would accept it because that's where I suppose that's where the information was coming from. From all other sources was coming through us. Yeah.
But I think just to be clear, so that it's understood, it's not as though the TEO had any other body of advice that covered that.
Not from from the health perspective, it would be coming from the Department of Health. Yes.
Obviously, I accept your point that when it comes to civil contingencies, there's a broader picture that needs to be looked at. But I think the important point is that, as it were, the conveying the advice and the information did in fact fall, I think, on your shoulders, and then the CMO as well. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
All right. So just, again, I think that taking this in stages, you then, again, attended Cobra on the 18th of February. I don't think we need to bring it up, but the understanding that this might escalate to a global pandemic does appear to have crystallised in and around that time. Do you agree with that?
If that's what's recorded in the minutes, yeah, it was around that time that there was an understanding that China wasn't going to be able to control.
Yeah. And I think, in fact, we probably should just bring that up just so that we're clear about that. So if we could go to the Cobra minutes, it's INQ 000 056 227, please. And if we could go to paragraph 1, please. Again, Mr. Swan, just do this to set the scene. Thank you, and I think that's lovely. That can come down, thank you. Oh, just that paragraph, please. If we could go back to the document. Sorry, I think you might have just caught it. It was set out underneath the fact that the two scenarios, I think at that stage, were regarded as plausible. I didn't want to mislead you, Mr. Swan. Thank you. If we could look at paragraph 2. So I think at that stage, what was being said was that both
remained, yeah.
And again, just understanding that from a Northern Ireland perspective, obviously when presented with those two contingencies, as we understand it, and as you'd said, you were preparing for, as it were, the worst case. And if we could go, please, to page 7, and the final bullet, please. And again, we've just above paragraph 17, Mr. Swan, we can see again this is planning for a reasonable worst case scenario. And if that could just come down, please. We can see reference to the Northern Ireland Strategic Civil Contingencies Group meeting. Yes?
Yes.
And I assume that what Cobra was being informed was that this was the meeting that was going to address the reasonable worst case scenario in Northern Ireland. And is that information that you would have provided, or is that something that would have been provided from the Executive Office, do you think?
I think that was, if I'm correct, I think that was the meeting that Dr. Chadas, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, made the presentation to.
Yes.
Yeah.
So can I ask, first of all, thank you, that can come down. It appears to the inquiry that meeting that took place on the 20th of February was the first civil contingencies meeting that took place at all across government in Northern Ireland. Is that your understanding?
That would be my understanding, yes.
And did you have any concerns at this time about the slow, and I say this, I'm not suggesting that it was your responsibility, but the fact that there hadn't been any sort of cross-departmental meeting until this date?
It wouldn't have been a concern at that point in time, because I suppose, and I'm looking at it from from a health point of view, of what we were doing, the information that we were providing to other departments. But in hindsight, in regards to that executive office, civil contingency, CCPB, NI response, it would have been a concern that it was taking them longer to stand up and actually getting into gear than I would expect now.
Yes. If we could just look at and we've seen this, but again, I would just like to ask you about it, the minutes of that meeting, INQ 000 023 220. And we've seen, and I think we probably only need to look at the priorities. Again, given that this was the 20th of February and that the departments regarded this as being the priorities, would that, or the fact that it certainly appears that this is a very limited set of considerations, given all that had been said by Cobra about planning for the reasonable worst case scenario, that this in Northern Ireland is what the priorities are identified as at the first meeting.
I think in regards to the briefing, and again, that was actually presented to that group, and I think if you read through the full presentation that was actually given by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer in regards to our concerns, or the Department of Health concerns, I'm slightly, I would say, surprised at regards that of the officials who were present, that this was the four that they identified, but maybe it was in regards to those were priorities that they saw stretching across each department rather than being from a health point of view. In regards to that's something that all departments should be aware of.
We've seen Dr. Chadda's presentation, and I won't take you to it, but we've seen that he does, for example, identify the possibility of excess deaths, and his presentation might be thought to have been quite realistic in that it set out, for example, the case fatality rate. So it's not an issue about the information that he provided, I think, but more perhaps that this appears to have been the response to it.
Yeah, and I think that, sorry if I'm not conveying that clearly, but I think when it comes to the cross-departmental response to what Dr. Chadda had actually presented, that these are the four priorities that are pointed out. But again, I think the last point, all organisations to review business continuity plans in light of reasonable worst case parameters, should be an indication then, if that's been raised at CCG-NI, surely the department, sorry, in my view, that those cross-departmental officials who were present at that meeting should actually be going back to their departments, to their ministers, and saying, look, this is what was discussed, this was what a priority from CCG-NI actually is as of the 20th of February.
Can I just ask you, that final paragraph refers to business continuity plans. Is that about their internal ability to?
Probably in regards to civil service speak, but again, as I'm saying, if you're going back, if your civil servant come back to a permanent secretary or minister and saying, we have to get our house in order because this is the reasonable worst case scenario, to me that should be ringing an alarm bell.
Yes. It might be the operative word, but looking at that, do you agree that that might be regarded as an underwhelming response to the level of concern that ought to have been sounding around departments at this stage?
In regards to, and my lady having seen Dr. Chadda's presentation, which you say was a realistic briefing as to the current situation, it would be, yes.
All right. And I think, again, I'm not going to go back. I won't take you to this, but you attended another Cobra meeting on the 26th of February. And what I wanted to ask you was whether you agree that, again, the picture building was one of increasing concern because of, for example, transmission into Italy and what was happening as well in Italy as well.
Yeah.
Was that something that you were conscious of? Or
It is, my lady, because by that stage I'd already made a number of statements to the Northern Ireland Assembly as well, so it was in such, I suppose, in my perception, that it was important enough to be doing that.
Can I just take you to one of those, please? Let's go to INQ 000 425 519. And this is this is an announcement, if that's the correct way to put it, that you gave. Just again for the date, it's the 28th of February. And if we could go, I think, to page 3 of this. I may need someone to help me with where we find it, but this said, and it may be that I need to take you to another page, Mr. Swan, but this announcement said that whilst the situation was serious, that it was far from certain that it would happen. Thank you. Detailed plans were in place should the virus become a pandemic. That idea that by the end of February, and this was for a speech or an announcement that you were going to give on the 1st of March 2020, that it was far from certain that it would happen, that it would become a pandemic. Was that your understanding at the time?
Well, I think it was still, come back to the two options still being considered, even at the minutes of the Cobra meeting, that it was still, the options were still there. And again, in this case, it's not about, I suppose, again, it's in regards to wording of a statement that was being made to the Northern Ireland Assembly, rather than get into the detail that the two options are still in play, even though that I am saying that it is, the situation is no doubt serious, but stressing the point that in recent cases we're very much still in containment phase.
No one was saying at that stage, were they, that it was far from certain that it would develop into a pandemic, were they?
Well, not generally, but again, in regards to the wording of that statement, it may have been an underestimation in regards to the seriousness as to where we were at that point, but not to be, I suppose, alerting or causing unnecessary alarm either in regards to the wording of it.
Almost immediately after this, there was another executive committee meeting, and others who've attended that meeting have said that that was the first substantive discussion that took place about Covid-19. So that was the 2nd of March. Does that also accord with your recollection?
I think it was, we had, and again, I suppose it's the use of the adjective substantive, my lady, in regards to it's the first time it moves into a standalone agenda item rather than being discussed or as an update under any other business. So in regards to that, yes, but I think we had, and again, the handwritten notes of those other meetings show that there has been an exchange in regards to ministers interacting or asking questions.
I haven't taken you back through all of the notes of the meetings in February because that would probably take quite a lot of time. But I think it's right, isn't it, that by and large it's a question of you providing an update to your colleagues about the position. The notes would suggest it's fairly short and that there's no detailed discussion afterwards. Do you accept that?
And I suppose that's, when I said earlier on in regards to me not raising it as a serious enough issue, at that stage I was still on the understanding that I was, as you say, you're providing an update to ministers, because I was aware that there was engagement being had by permanent secretaries at CCGNI. So in my view at that point, I was updating ministers as to what I thought they already should have been aware of from their officials. But now, in retrospect, and I've seen the evidence from Minister Weir, my lady, and I think whereas that actually hadn't been the case in his case.
And we also knew from Mr. Pengelly's evidence that, in fact, I think up until about the 21st of February, he was still giving the advice that there was no need for the civil contingencies arrangements to be stood up in Northern Ireland. And I think, again, that idea unless and until the virus arrived in Northern Ireland. Again, were you aware at that time that that was the advice that was being given by the Permanent Secretary?
I wasn't, I wasn't aware, as I said specifically at that time, that we were saying don't stand up, NICMA, but in reflection in regards to, as I've said to the previous answer, as to when it was necessary to stand it up and move into that response phase. I do think we could have possibly moved earlier, again, to raise that red flag to other departments, to other executive bodies, and I'm very much in agreement with what David Sterling was saying in his evidence.
Do you think, and again, maybe this is a judgment in retrospect, that throughout February 2020 there was a failure to understand quite how serious the picture was that had accrued and the information that had accrued over that period of time?
And again, asking from a retrospective point of view, I wouldn't agree there was a lack of understanding. I've said this, I think the failure may have been in the level of the alert or the seriousness that was moved up. And again, it goes back to, I think it was the Chief Medical Officer sort of coined the phrase of that rising tide event. I'm not sure as each level went up that we were ringing the bell loud enough as it went on for other departments, other ministers in other areas actually to take up their actions and their responsibilities as well.
And again, just coming to the end of February, what was being done in your department? Again, I'm just coming back to what must have been a growing understanding of on your part that this would require surveillance infrastructure, that it would require testing infrastructure, tracing infrastructure. What was your understanding about capabilities in Northern Ireland to deal with that?
Well, and I suppose at that stage it was, in regards to testing capabilities, there was no test. I suppose in the early days in regards to COVID, I'm not sure of work in February being done to develop tests, but once the genome became available, I know our virology lab in Belfast was actually one of the first 13 sites across the UK that was able to test. So those sort of steps in preparation were being put in place in regards to testing, the tracing capability. And I think, my lady, it was often portrayed that tracing was a new development just because of COVID, but we already had a division within our PHA in regards to actually that tracing capability, although not large. In regards to that, I do know now and again from the inquiry, unfortunately, the PHA wasn't in a robust situation, a robust enough situation to scale up at pace as was necessary or could have been done when the tests became available as well. So there was much work being done, and again, it's the phrase in the background in regards to the preparation. The letter, the document that you've shared from the Chief Medical Officer indicates, as we moved from the establishment of silver, the activation of gold, as to where those responsibilities and asks were actually coming.
Just first of all, testing. Obviously, I think a test was. I will get the exact date, but I think tests were available at a point in January. But obviously, that's a different question from the ability to scale up testing and what was being done by your department to understand what challenges there might be to doing that. That's the first question. And then the second question is, obviously the PHA was an extremely small organisation, correct?
Yeah.
And its ability to carry out tracing and the limitations must have been very obvious from an early stage. Sorry, those are two separate questions.
And again, in regards to tests, the early test that was developed was, and again, not coming from that laboratory scientific background that was necessary, but the analysis that those tests were, and I think, my lady, we now become used to the lateral flow test that everybody expects that where it was. We were using highly complicated equipment within our virology lab in Belfast. We were able to expand that out across lab equipment elsewhere, from our universities. Actually, AFBI as well, part of our Department of Agriculture, provided their lab facilities as well. So there was work being done. I'm not sure if it was specifically at that stage in early February where that kicked in, but we did establish an expert advisory group on testing that looked at the different avenues and different opportunities that we had across Northern Ireland. In regards to PHA and the testing, I think in regards to those initial phases as to how we did contact or the follow-up tracing, was there but not there as a facility that could be expanded quickly enough. But then again, it was reliant on testing as well. But again, I know there are some challenges and deficiencies within the PHA in regards to that testing capability, which weren't brought to my attention at that point in time as we moved on. Again, and I'm jumping quite a bit.
I suppose what I'm asking you about is your awareness of that and your understanding of that in this crucial planning phase, that key parts of the response to the pandemic in Northern Ireland were actually quite seriously understaffed and at subpar capability.
Yeah, and I think, Milady, that does go back to, I think, some of the opening comments in regards to that lack of investment that we actually had in health. And when I talk about investment in health, it's not just about the hospitals, it's the wider structure as well, so also our arm's length bodies as well in regards to that.
But taking that as read and going back to the planning that was going on, can we assume then that in the planning and at this critical phase, you didn't understand that there were likely to be quite serious limitations, for example, on what the PHA could actually do?
No, it wasn't that, because I do remember, I think it was the first case we had, was I actually visited our contact tracing centre in Belfast and Lennon Hall Street and was very impressed with the setup they had, the ability to scale it up as to a small number of cases, but not to the extent that we eventually saw.
Right.
Is that
I think it's a good time to break. Thank you.
Very well, I shall return at 1:45.